The desperate widow, in the deep reaches of space on a planet forgotten by time, there was an alien widow who lived in the shadows of her lost civilization. Her name was Zara, a mother who had once known happiness and peace. But now, all she knew was hunger, sorrow, and the desperate need to protect her two small children. Her home planet, Lunath, a vibrant world with lush forests and beautiful seas, was now reduced to a barren wasteland. Once her people were known across the galaxy for their advanced technology and peaceful ways, but those days were long gone. The planet had been attacked, torn apart by merciless invaders, and everything she had ever loved was destroyed. The Gyu War had taken her husband and many others, and in a twist of fate, she had been left alone to survive. Zara's heart ached as she looked down at her children. They were thin, their eyes dull from the lack of food. The smallest, Kylo, could barely stand on his own 2 feet. His once bright eyes were now empty and glassy, his tiny frame shaking with hunger. Rena, her daughter, clung to her side, a shadow of the lively girl she had once been. Her skin was pale, and her once vibrant golden hair now hung lifeless in tangled strands. Zara tried to comfort them as best as she could, but every word felt like a lie. There was no food, no hope. All she could offer them was a smile that didn't reach her eyes and the promise that things would be better tomorrow, even though deep inside, she knew that tomorrow might never come. The wind howled outside their shelter, a tiny hut made of scraps of metal and broken technology, pieces of her once proud civilization that now served only to keep the bitter cold at bay. The stars above, once a beautiful sight, now felt like cruel reminders of what was lost. There were no ships coming to rescue her, no help on the horizon. Her people had been scattered, and the rest of the galaxy had long forgotten Lunath and its people. But Zara wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't. Her children were all she had left. As long as they were alive, she would keep fighting. Days passed and her desperation grew. She rationed the last of their food, but it was nearly gone. Soon, there would be nothing left. She had already searched every corner of the planet for any sign of help, but there was none. It seemed as though they were completely alone in this vast, unforgiving universe. There was no other civilization for light years, and even the food she had scavenged from the ruins of her city had run out. One cold night, as Zara sat near the small fire she had managed to start, her eyes lifted to the sky once more. The stars twinkled, mocking her with their beauty. Then something caught her eye, a distant light in the sky moving fast. It wasn't a natural star, it was something else. A ship. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could it be a human ship? Her people had never encountered humans before, but she had heard stories of how humans had helped other species in need, how they were known for their kindness and bravery. But Zara was afraid. What if this was a trick? What if they were enemies, coming to finish what the invaders had started? She had no way of knowing, and yet, something deep inside her told her that this might be her only chance. She couldn't afford to waste it. She had nothing left to lose. The small voice of Rina broke through her thoughts. "Mama, what is that light?" Rina whispered, her small hand clutching Zara's. Zara smiled softly and kissed her daughter's forehead. "I don't know, sweetie. But we'll find out, won't we?" With trembling hands, she stood up and gathered her children. They didn't understand what was happening, but they trusted her. Kylo, too weak to walk, was carried by Zara, and together they made their way out of the shelter. The wind bit at their skin as they moved across the barren land. Zara held them close, her eyes fixed on the light growing brighter in the sky. The ship was coming closer, and with each passing moment her heart raced faster. As they reached a clearing, Zara stopped. She couldn't help but stare at the ship. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before. Its sleek silver hull reflected the light of the stars, and it seemed to glow with an otherworldly energy. The sound of its engines grew louder, and soon it was hovering just above them. Zara's heart was pounding now. What was she supposed to do? She had no words, no plans. But her children were starving, and the fear in her heart was overshadowed by one thought. She had to save them no matter the cost. Suddenly, a hatch on the ship opened, and a figure descended. It was a human, a tall man, dressed in a uniform, that looked like it belonged to some sort of space military. His face was hidden beneath a helmet, but there was something about him that seemed both distant and kind. Are you an alien?" Zara whispered, the words trembling in her mouth. The man didn't answer at first. He simply looked at her and her children, his expression unreadable. The ship's engines hummed softly in the background as he took a step forward, his gaze lingering on the children, their fragile forms barely standing. Zara's heart raced. Was he here to help them? Or was this the end of the line for her family? She had no way of knowing, but she had to take a chance. She knelt in front of him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, feed my children. I will do anything. Please." Her voice cracked as she spoke, and the man's eyes softened. But he didn't speak. He only stood there, his hand reaching toward her. What would he say? Would he help? The silence stretched on, and Zara held her breath. The alien mother's story. Zara had never imagined that her life would come to this. As a child, she had lived in a lush, vibrant city on the planet Lunath, one of the most beautiful worlds in the galaxy. Her people, the Lunarians, were peaceful and highly intelligent. They lived in harmony with nature and had developed advanced technology that could harness the power of the stars. There was no war, no conflict, only progress and prosperity. It was a golden age for her people. But all of that changed when the E-Time invasion came. Zara remembered that day like it had happened yesterday. The sky had been clear, a perfect day to visit the great archives of their city. Zara and her husband, Zyron, had been walking through the city's gardens, laughing as they watched their children, Rhina and Kylo, play in the fields of glowing flowers. It was a typical afternoon, a peaceful, ordinary moment that would forever be etched in her mind. Then, without warning, the sky darkened. At first, it was just a strange shadow moving across the sun. Zara had thought it was just an eclipse, a natural event. But the shadow grew larger, darker, and faster. Then, with a deafening roar, the sky split open. Great ships, black as night, descended from above, their engines howling like beasts in pain. Zara's heart pounded in her chest as the first explosions rocked the ground. Her husband grabbed her, pulling her to the ground. The shockwave from the blast sent debris flying, and for a moment everything seemed to blur and spin. She couldn't hear anything but the ringing in her ears and the screams of people running for their lives. "They're here. They've come," Zyron whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Zara's mind raced. Who were these invaders? Why were they attacking Lunath? She had no answers, but she didn't have time to ask. The invaders were relentless, their weapons devastating. They didn't just destroy cities, they annihilated entire ecosystems. The Lunarians were caught completely off guard, unprepared for the sheer force of the attack. Their advanced technology was no match for the speed and brutality of the invaders. Zara and Zyron had tried to escape. They had taken their children and fled into the wilderness, hoping to find safety. But it was impossible to outrun the destruction. Within days, the planet was in chaos. The invaders targeted everything: the cities, the food supplies, the very land itself. Zara watched as the places she had once loved were turned to ash, the skies filled with smoke and fire. Siren had kept them moving, always searching for a safe haven, but Zara could see the weariness in his eyes. He was a strong man, a warrior, who had fought for his people, but even he knew they were losing. Slowly, they began to run out of food, and with each passing day, the weight of their journey became harder to bear. It wasn't long before the food reserves they had gathered ran dry, and the hunger began to take its toll. One evening, as they camped by a dried-up riverbed, Zyron made the hardest decision of his life. They couldn't go on like this anymore. The children were too weak to keep moving, and the constant fear of the invaders was taking its toll. Zyron knew that he couldn't protect them forever. He told Zara they needed to split up. "I'll go and find help," he said, his voice steady, but filled with a deep sadness. "You take the children and find shelter. I'll bring back food, I promise." Zara had protested, but Zyron was determined. She kissed him goodbye, not knowing it would be the last time. She never saw him again. The days stretched into weeks, and still, Zyron didn't return. It wasn't until much later that Zara learned the truth. Zyron had been captured by the invaders and executed. The news broke her heart. She had lost everything. Her husband, her home, her people. All that remained were her children, and the painful, hollow ache in her chest. Zara had tried to survive, but the odds were stacked against her. The planet was dying, and so were her children. With every passing day, she watched as the light in their eyes grew dimmer. She had to keep moving, searching for food, shelter, anything that could keep them alive for one more day. But the planet was a graveyard now, a desolate wasteland with no hope in sight. There were moments when Zara felt like giving up, when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear, and the thought of seeing her children suffer broke her spirit. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. Every time she looked into their eyes, she saw a spark of hope, a desire to live, that reminded her why she kept going. "I'll never let you die," she would whisper to them, even when she didn't believe the words herself. But somehow her resolve never wavered. She would do whatever it took to protect them. She would face the darkness, the fear, and the endless hunger, but she would never give up on them. One day, as they sat huddled in their shelter, Zara heard a sound, a distant, low hum. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, and soon she realized it wasn't just any noise, it was the sound of a ship. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Was someone finally coming to save them? She rushed outside, pulling her children along. They had been living in this barren, lifeless world for so long that they barely remembered what it was like to see a real ship. The thought of help, of food, of salvation was almost too much to believe. But as the ship came closer, Zara's hope turned to fear. The ship didn't look like a rescue vessel. It wasn't a peaceful transport. No, this ship was different. It was sleek, metallic, and ominous. There was no flag of peace, no symbol of salvation. And yet, it was the only chance they had left. Zara's instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't. She had no place to hide, and her children were too weak to move fast enough. The ship hovered overhead, casting a long shadow over them. A figure emerged from the hatch, tall and imposing, dressed in a strange, dark uniform. For a moment, everything stood still. Zara's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward. She didn't know if this human would be her savior or her doom. But one thing was certain. This encounter would decide the fate of her children and perhaps the fate of her entire species. Her heart pounded as she took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Please, feed my children. I'll do anything." And so the story of her plea began, the human's first encounter. The air grew thick with tension as Zara stood in front of the strange human figure, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. The ship above them hummed softly, a low mechanical sound that echoed in the silence of the barren landscape. Zara's breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to make sense of the situation. Was this human a friend? Or was he just another stranger from a cold, indifferent universe? The human figure stood still for a long moment, watching her and her children with an inscrutable gaze. His face was hidden behind a dark helmet, reflecting no emotions, no thoughts, just a cold, polished surface. The silence stretched on, making Zara's skin crawl. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed, standing before this unknown force. The desolate world around them only added to the weight of the moment, as if the very land itself was holding its breath. Zara clenched her fists, the desperation in her eyes growing sharper with each passing second. Her children, Rhina and Kylo, were too weak to even speak. They clung to her, their tiny hands trembling in fear, the hunger and exhaustion leaving them lifeless. The weight of her promise to them pressed down on Zara's shoulders. She had told them that things would get better, But how could she keep that promise if no one would help? The human didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Then, finally, he spoke, a deep mechanical voice that seemed to carry an unspoken power in its tone. "You are Lunarian," he said, his words measured, almost clinical. He wasn't asking. It was a statement. Zara nodded quickly, feeling a wave of relief. He knew what she was. At least that was one thing they had in common. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. "Please, my children are dying. I will do anything. Just feed them, please." There was a slight pause before the human took a step forward. He didn't seem to show any emotion, but Zara couldn't shake the feeling that he was studying her every movement. His presence was overwhelming, like a force she couldn't fully comprehend. She felt so small in front of him, as if he could decide her fate in an instant, and the thought made her chest tighten. "You say you will do anything," he said, his voice colder now. "What do you think that means?" Zara felt a chill run down her spine. She had no idea what he meant, but she didn't care. She only cared about keeping her children alive. The desperation in her voice grew as she continued. "Anything, I'll serve you, I'll help you with whatever you need, I have nothing left, please." The human's helmeted gaze never wavered, but Zara could sense that he was considering her words. What was he thinking? Was he weighing her words, deciding whether or not to help them? The uncertainty was maddening, and Zara fought the urge to scream. Every second felt like a lifetime. Finally, after what felt like hours, the human spoke again, his voice low and cold. "I'm not here for charity. I'm not here to save you out of the goodness of my heart. You want food? Then you'll work for it." Zara's stomach twisted. The words hit her like a slap. Work? Was that all they were to him? A means to an end? She had no idea what kind of work he was talking about, but she didn't care. She had no choice. She needed to save her children. "Anything," Zara repeated, her voice hoarse. "Just tell me what to do." The human seemed to study her for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to trust her. Then, without warning, he turned his back and walked toward the ship, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "Follow me," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. Zara hesitated for just a moment, glancing down at her children. Raina's eyes were wide with fear, and Kylo's tiny body trembled in her arms. She didn't want to drag them into this unknown, but what choice did she have? She had already promised them she would do whatever it took to keep them alive. With a deep breath, Zara nodded. "Come on, children," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "We're going with him. Stay close." Raina and Kylo didn't argue. They were too weak to protest, their eyes glazed over with the exhaustion and hunger that had taken hold of them. They followed Zara as she stepped cautiously toward the ship, every step a mix of fear and hope. The human led them to the entrance of the ship, and the hatch opened with a soft hiss. Inside, the ship was like nothing Zara had ever seen. The walls were made of a strange metallic substance that shimmered in the dim light, and the air smelled sterile and cold, like something out of a dream. The ship's interior was sleek, functional, designed for efficiency, not comfort. Once inside, the human gestured for Zara and her children to sit down on a row of seats along the wall. Zara settled her children next to her, trying her best to comfort them as she glanced nervously at the human who stood in front of them, his hands clasped behind his back. "I'll tell you what you need to do," the human said, his voice firm. "But first you need to prove that you're capable. Prove that you can do what's required." Zara's heart skipped a beat. What was he talking about? What could he possibly want from her? The fear rose again, but she quickly pushed it aside. She had already come this far. She couldn't back down now. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes locked on his. The human stepped closer, lowering his voice to a chilling whisper of his own. "I need you to help me secure resources. There are other survivors on this planet. People who could use your help. But I need someone who can work without hesitation. Someone who will do whatever it takes to survive. Zara's heart raced. Survivors? Was there anyone else left on this desolate planet? She couldn't imagine that there were. But the human's words held a different meaning. He wasn't just offering food, he was offering something more. A way to survive in this world of broken promises. I will do anything, she repeated, this time with more conviction. Tell me what I need to do. The human paused for a moment, his helmeted face unreadable. Then, with a voice that was colder than the vacuum of space, he said, You'll need to follow orders. Help me gather supplies, help me search for those who are still alive, and maybe, just maybe, your children will live. Zara's blood ran cold. She had already known the price of survival. But now, it felt like the true cost was becoming clearer. Would she be willing to sacrifice everything, including her morals, to save her children? And what kind of person, what kind of creature, was she becoming in the process? The ship's engines hummed louder as the human turned and began to walk away. Zara looked at her children one last time before standing up to follow him. A cold, bitter resolve settled in her chest. She had no choice now. She had entered a dangerous game, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. The unlikely deal. The days blurred together in the sterile interior of the human ship. Zara's eyes grew accustomed to the dim lighting, and the humming of the engines became a constant, monotonous presence in her mind. But despite the routine, nothing felt normal. The air was thick with uncertainty, every turn a reminder that she had stepped into a world far beyond her understanding. The human's words from their first encounter echoed in her mind, "Prove you can do what's required." Every moment since they boarded the ship, Zara felt the weight of those words pressing down on her, suffocating her. She had promised to do anything to save her children, but what anything truly meant was still unclear. What did he expect from her? What had she signed up for? Her children were quieter now. Rhina, always the brave one, had stopped asking questions. Kylo barely made a sound, his small form wrapped in layers of blankets, his face pale and drawn from hunger. They were both weak, but there was still a flicker of life in their eyes, something she clung to, hoping against hope that whatever was about to happen next would not be the end of them. The human had not spoken much after their initial meeting. He gave her a set of tasks to complete. Simple ones at first, cleaning the ship, organizing supplies, and performing small repairs. She had done them without hesitation, her movements mechanical, driven by the single thought that everything she did would bring her children closer to safety. But the tasks seemed endless, a never-ending loop of mindless chores that left her with little time to think or ask questions. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, the human approached her again. His helmet was now off, revealing a young face, much younger than Zara had imagined. His features were sharp, his eyes cold but calculating. He looked human, yes, but there was something unsettling about him. Something about his gaze, the way it seemed to pierce through her, made her uneasy. "You've done well," the human said, his voice low, almost indifferent. He paused, as if choosing his next words, carefully. "But the real test is still ahead." Zara's heart sank. "Test? What do you mean?" Her voice was steady, but inside she felt the fear rise like a tidal wave. The human's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You've proven yourself capable, but now you'll have to prove something else." Zara swallowed, hard. What else could I possibly prove? He stepped closer, his posture rigid. "You see, Zara, survival isn't just about physical strength. It's about trust, loyalty, willingness to bend when necessary. Everything comes with a price. The food you've been promised, the safety for your children, it's all tied to your ability to follow orders. No questions, no hesitation." Zara's pulse quickened. She was beginning to understand the true nature of the deal she had entered. This was not about survival alone. It was about power, control, and sacrifice. She looked at her children, sitting in the corner of the ship, too tired to even play with the small toys she had scavenged for them. Rhina was resting her head on Kylo's lap, both of them weak and vulnerable. In that moment, Zara realized that she had no choice. The human held the key to their survival. "I'll do anything," she repeated, her voice firm, though her stomach churned. "Just tell me what you need." The human's eyes darkened, and for the first time Zara saw something resembling interest in his gaze. "There's a supply depot on the surface of this planet," he said slowly, as if savoring the moment. "It's located in the ruins of an old Lunarian city. The invaders didn't completely destroy it. There's a lot of useful technology and resources there. Food, medicine, equipment, the kind of things you and your children need to survive." Zara's heart skipped a beat. A depot. Was this the opportunity she had been waiting for? The chance to secure enough supplies to keep her children alive? "There's one problem," the human continued, his voice growing colder. "The invaders have a stronghold nearby. It's heavily guarded. Getting in won't be easy, and you'll have to work with me. If you refuse, your children will suffer the consequences." Zara's breath caught in her throat. She had heard of the invaders, merciless conquerors who had ravaged countless planets. But she hadn't realized that they were still here, so close to where she and her children had taken refuge. The idea of facing them was terrifying. But what choice did she have? She had to try. She had to take the risk. "And if I help you?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. "Will you give us the food? Will you promise that my children will be safe?" The human stared at her for a long time as if weighing her words. Then, with a slow nod, he responded, "I'll honor my word. But remember this, you won't just be helping me. You'll be helping yourself. The sooner you complete the task, the sooner I'll provide what you've asked for. You'll get the food, the resources, and your children will live." Zara's mind raced as she considered the offer. It wasn't just a simple mission, it was a life-or-death gamble. The stakes were higher than anything she had ever imagined. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. But there was no other option. If she wanted to keep her children alive, she had to trust this human. She had to trust him, no matter how dangerous the mission was. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady now. "I'll help you." The human smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "Good. But remember, Zara, there's no turning back once you begin. The moment you step onto that planet, you're committed. Do you understand?" Zara nodded, her resolve hardening. She understood the gravity of the situation all too well. There was no turning back. If she wanted to save her children, she had no choice but to follow through. The human turned and began walking toward the hatch that led to the ship's exit. "Get ready," he said over his shoulder. "We leave at dawn." As Zara watched him walk away, her mind spun with thoughts of what lay ahead. A supply depot, a stronghold, the invaders, the unknown. The danger was real, and she had no idea what she would face on the surface of Lunath. But one thing was certain, she had made a deal, and now she had to see it through. For her children, for her survival. There was no room for fear anymore. Only the cold, hard reality of what it would take to keep her promise. As she turned back to her children, Zara made a silent vow. She would survive. She would do whatever it took, no matter the cost. The human's proposal, the air on the human ship felt colder now, heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in on Zara. The weight of the decision she had just made hung like a dense fog in her mind. She had committed to a course of action. But as the hatch to the ship's exit loomed in the distance, uncertainty gripped her heart. The human's offer was a lifeline, but it was also a trap. She knew that. She wasn't naive. But the choice was clear. Follow the human, risk everything, or watch her children die slowly, painfully, in this desolate wasteland. The thought of her children's gaunt faces, their hollow eyes, pushed her forward. She couldn't afford hesitation. Every moment wasted could be another breath her children didn't get to take. She had promised them survival, and promises to children were never empty. With a deep, steadying breath, Zara forced her doubts into the recesses of her mind and steeled herself for what was to come. As the ship descended toward the surface of Lunath, the pale glow of the dying sun bathed the land in an eerie light. The once vibrant landscapes she had known were now barely recognizable. The land was scarred, the forests reduced to charred stumps, and the once thriving cities had been reduced to ruins. The planet was a shadow of its former self, and the smell of ash and decay lingered in the air. But even in the midst of this destruction, Zara could see the glimmer of hope. This was her last chance. The human didn't speak much as the ship landed, his movements sharp and deliberate, as though everything was routine. The hatch opened with a mechanical hiss and Zara stepped out into the dusty, broken landscape, her heart racing. The wind was biting cold, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her body, shivering as the ship's engines powered down. She stood for a moment, scanning the horizon. It was a desolate wasteland. The ruins of what was once a grand city were spread out before her, like the skeleton of a dead giant. Skyscrapers lay in heaps of rubble, their jagged spires jutting out of the ground like broken teeth. Streets that were once bustling with life were now empty, silent, haunted by memories of a people long gone. "Stay close," the human's voice cut through the silence. He had already started walking, his footsteps purposeful and confident as he led her deeper into the ruins. Zara followed without hesitation, her children trailing behind her, barely able to keep up. The journey was slow. They couldn't afford to make a sound, and the tension in the air was palpable. Every step felt like they were walking on the edge of a razor. They moved through the crumbling streets, the ruins of Lunath's great civilization towering over them like the ghosts of a lost era. There was no sign of life, no movement, nothing but the eerie stillness of a world in its death throes. As they reached a large, ruined building, the human stopped and motioned for Zara to join him. They stood at the entrance for a moment, the shadows of the building looming over them. Zara could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on, and something didn't feel right. She glanced around, scanning the surrounding area. The silence was deafening, and the weight of it made her pulse quicken. "The depot is inside," the human said, his voice almost drowned out by the wind. "The supplies are well hidden, but they're there. It's the last place the invaders would expect us to look." Zara nodded, though her mind raced with doubts. The human seemed too sure of himself, too confident. He didn't seem worried at all. Was he always this calm, or was there something else at play here? She didn't have the answers, but she couldn't afford to ask questions. She had to keep moving, keep her eyes on the prize. Her children were counting on her. The human motioned for her to follow him into the building. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of emergency lamps that flickered above. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, twisted metal, and scraps of technology that had once powered the city's systems. The smell of decay was overwhelming, as though the building had been abandoned for far longer than it actually had. "Stay alert," the human said as he moved deeper into the building. "There may still be scavengers or worse, invaders hiding here. They'll do anything to protect the resources left on this planet." Zara's heart pounded as she took a step forward, her eyes darting around the room, every shadow now a potential threat. She had no weapon, no way to defend herself or her children if something went wrong. All she had was her wits, her determination, and her promise to her children. They continued through the darkened halls, each step echoing loudly in the silence. The building seemed endless, a labyrinth of decaying corridors and crumbling walls. The air was thick with dust, and Zara's breath became shallow, her nerves on edge. Finally, they reached a large reinforced door at the end of the hallway. The human stopped in front of it and turned to Zara. "This is it," he said, his voice low and almost expectant. "The depot is behind this door. But be careful. We don't know what's waiting inside. It could be heavily guarded or worse, rigged with traps. Stay close." Zara nodded, though a knot formed in her stomach. She felt a chill that wasn't from the cold. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. She could feel it in the air, a tangible sense of danger that pressed against her chest. The human stepped forward and placed his hand on a panel beside the door. There was a soft beep, followed by a mechanical whirring sound as the door slid open. What lay beyond it was a darkened room, stacked high with crates, equipment, and supplies. Food, medical supplies, weapons, and technology. The sight of it was both a relief and a reminder of just how dangerous this situation was. Before she could take a step forward, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor behind them. Zara's heart stopped. The human's eyes narrowed, his posture instantly alert. "They're here," he whispered. "Scavengers." Zara felt a surge of panic. How could they have missed them? Where had they come from? The human held up a hand, signaling her to stay quiet. "Get ready," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "We need to be quick. If they get to the supplies first, we lose everything." Zara's mind raced. She had no choice now. She had made a deal with this man and there was no turning back. The room before her held the hope of survival for her children, but it was also a battleground. The stakes had never been higher. "Get the supplies," the human said, his voice firm. "I'll handle the rest." Zara nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. She turned to face the crates, but as she reached for the first one, the sound of gunfire rang out, followed by shouts. The battle had begun. The human had kept his word. But Zara wasn't sure if she was ready for the true cost of their deal. The promise of food and supplies was within her reach, but survival was never as simple as it seemed. And in that moment, she realized that the path she had chosen was darker and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The dangerous mission. The gunfire echoed through the crumbling walls of the old Lunath depot, sending tremors through the air, shaking loose bits of debris from the ceiling. Zara's heart hammered in her chest as she crouched behind a large stack of crates, her mind racing. Her body was alive with adrenaline, every instinct screaming at her to stay hidden, to move quickly, to survive. She could hear the shouts of the scavengers growing louder. They were closing in, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. Zara's grip tightened on the weapon the human had given her. Something small and sleek, a strange contraption that felt almost too light for the task at hand. It was designed for quick, close-range combat, a far cry from the advanced weapons her people had once wielded, but it was the only tool she had. Behind her, she could hear the human moving swiftly, a low growl of frustration escaping from his lips. His movements were fluid, calculated, a warrior in his element. He didn't seem fazed by the danger that surrounded them. He seemed to thrive on it. But Zara wasn't like him. She wasn't a trained fighter. Her life had been one of peace, of healing, and love for her children. But now, she was forced into a war zone, with no choice but to fight for survival. The scavengers weren't the only threat, though. The Lunath city had once been a hub of scientific progress, and its ruins now held secrets that could turn the tide of the war. Zara knew that the invaders had left traps hidden in the wreckage. Booby traps designed to slow or stop anyone who dared to get close to the supplies they had left behind. "Stay low." The human's voice cut through the chaos, calm and steady, as always. "We need to move fast. The longer we stay here, the more danger we're in. Get to the central vault. I'll cover you." Zara's breath caught in her throat. The central vault. She knew what it contained, more than just food and medicine. The vault housed the advanced Lunarian technology that had once been the envy of the galaxy. Weapons, energy sources, data cores with centuries of knowledge. Everything the invaders had sought to destroy. If they could secure it, if she could protect it, it would be worth far more than just survival. But the vault was heavily guarded, and the scavengers would be the least of her worries once they reached it. The invaders had been in Lunath long, enough to set up strongholds to fortify the area. Zara could already hear the distant hum of their advanced machines, the whir of drones patrolling the area. They wouldn't let anyone take the vault without a fight. "We can't waste any time," Zara whispered, more to herself than to the human. She tightened her grip on the weapon and glanced back at her children, who were crouched behind a pile of crates, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. They hadn't seen anything like this before. The horror, the violence. It was foreign to them. "Stay here," Zara said to them, her voice as calm as she could make it, though her heart was racing. "Do not move, I'll be right back." Her children nodded, too scared to argue, and Zara turned back toward the human. He was already advancing, moving with silent precision, his body a blur of motion as he checked every corner, every darkened alcove for threats. Together, they moved through the building, silent and swift. Zara's feet barely made a sound on the cracked floor, her eyes scanning every shadow, every movement, every flicker of light. She had never been a warrior. She wasn't trained for this, but desperation made her sharp. It made her instincts honed to a deadly edge. They reached the next section of the building without encountering any scavengers. But as they moved closer to the central vault, Zara felt the atmosphere shift. It wasn't just the tension of the mission or the knowledge that they were walking into enemy territory. It was something more primal. There was something watching them, something lurking just out of sight. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. "What is it?" she whispered to the human, her eyes scanning the walls. The human paused, his face hardening as he turned toward her. "Nothing," he said quietly, though his eyes betrayed him. He could feel it too, the presence that had settled in the air. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the hallway. A door at the far end of the corridor flew open, and figures emerged from the shadows, scavengers armed and ready. They were fast, desperate, and they had no intention of letting Zara and the human get away with the supplies. "Take cover!" the human shouted as he dove behind a column of debris, pulling Zara with him. The scavengers spread out, their weapons raised, their eyes sharp. They had been waiting for this moment, lying in wait for someone to come close enough to attack. Zara's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched behind the cover, the weapon trembling in her hands. She couldn't let them stop her. Not now. Not when her children's lives were on the line. "On my signal," the human whispered, his voice steady, calculated. "We'll move to the vault. Ready?" Zara nodded, though doubt gnawed at her insides. She had never been in combat like this, but she couldn't think about that. She had to focus. "For my children," she reminded herself. The human counted down silently with his fingers, his movements fluid, practiced. When he reached 0, he shot out from behind the cover with a speed that took Zara's breath away. He moved like lightning, firing his weapon with precision, taking out one scavenger after another before they even knew what was happening. Zara hesitated, her legs frozen for a split second as she watched the human in action. He was unstoppable. Each move, each shot, perfectly calculated. But she couldn't let him fight alone. Not now. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Zara darted from her hiding spot and sprinted across the open ground, her weapon raised and ready. The scavengers had underestimated her. She fired, hitting one of them square in the chest. The man crumpled to the ground with a shocked expression, his weapon falling from his hands. But there was no time to celebrate. The human was already ahead of her, his pace unrelenting, leading the charge toward the vault. The scavengers regrouped, but they were no match for the human's deadly precision and Zara's newfound determination. The two of them moved as one, each action synchronized, working together like a well-oiled machine. Finally, they reached the vault door. Zara's hands were shaking with exhaustion and fear, but there was no turning back. The human gestured to her. "Open it," he ordered. "It's all you." Zara's breath caught in her throat as she approached the vault's control panel. She could feel the eyes of the enemy closing in, could hear their shouts and gunfire getting closer. Time was running out. She pressed her hand against the console, her fingers slick with sweat, and waited for the familiar beep that would grant them access. Every second felt like a lifetime. The door slid open with a low groan, revealing the treasure trove of supplies inside. But there was no time to celebrate. The human's voice snapped through the chaos. "Move!" They rushed inside, grabbing whatever they could. Weapons, medical supplies, food, everything they had come for. But as Zara turned to leave, a voice echoed from behind her. "You won't escape," it hissed, a cruel, mocking tone, lacing the words. You'll never leave this place alive. Zara turned to face the source of the voice, her heart in her throat. The invaders were here, and they were ready to fight for what was theirs. The battle had only just begun. The ultimate choice. The air inside the vault was thick with the smell of old metal and dust, but Zara barely registered the scent. Her pulse was a drumbeat in her ears, drowning out everything except the rush of adrenaline that surged through her veins. They had made it. They had secured the supplies, but the feeling of victory was fleeting. The invaders were closing in, fast, their footsteps heavy and sure, each echo a reminder of the danger that surrounded them. The vault's doors had barely closed behind them when the distant sounds of marching boots reached her ears. It was as if the very ground beneath her feet trembled with the weight of the soldiers approaching. Zara turned to the human, her breath shallow, her chest tightening as she looked at the door, wondering how long it would hold against the oncoming force. "We don't have much time," the human said, his voice grim, though there was a fire in his eyes. "We've got what we came for, but we won't make it out alive unless we move quickly." Zara nodded, her heart still racing. The supplies they'd taken were worth their weight in gold, but they were now trapped inside the vault with the only exit leading directly into the heart of the enemy's stronghold. The cold, harsh reality settled in. They had no way out, no safe haven, only the looming threat of annihilation. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Zara knew she couldn't back down. She had made a promise to her children. She had sacrificed so much to keep them alive. She had to see this through. "Do you have a plan?" Zara asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The human didn't answer immediately. His gaze was focused, scanning the room for any potential escape routes. He moved quickly, his eyes darting across the shelves filled with Lunarian technology, energy cells, and supplies. A map of the city's ruined sectors flickered on a nearby screen, and the human's finger traced a path across it. "The quickest way out is through the maintenance tunnels," he said, his voice low and steady. "They're our best shot, but the invaders might already have patrols in place. We'll have to move fast and silent, no mistakes." Zara swallowed hard, the weight of what they were about to do sinking in. They were going to have to fight their way out, and the stakes were higher than ever. The survival of her children, her own life. It all rested on the next few minutes. If they failed, if they were caught, the invaders would have no mercy. They wouldn't just kill them, they'd make them suffer. "Where are the children?" the human asked, his voice suddenly urgent. Zara's heart skipped a beat as she turned to check on them. Her children were huddled together in the far corner of the vault, their faces pale with fear. Rhina had her arm around Kylo, trying to comfort him as he trembled. Zara's throat tightened at the sight of them. They were so fragile, so innocent, and the world they had known had been ripped from them in an instant. It wasn't fair. None of this was fair. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice trembling as she made her way toward them. Rhina looked up at her, her wide eyes filled with fear. "What's happening, Mama?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are they coming?" Zara crouched beside her daughter, her hands shaking as she stroked Rhina's hair. "We're going to get out of here," she said softly, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "I promise, we're going to make it. But the bad people, will they hurt us?" Kylo's small voice cracked and Zara's heart clenched. Zara hesitated, unsure of how to answer. The truth was too painful to say aloud. But there was no time to comfort them with false promises. "We're strong," she whispered, squeezing both of their hands tightly. "And we're going to make it out, just trust me, okay?" Rhina nodded silently and Kylo clung to her. Zara could feel the weight of their trust, the unspoken belief that she could protect them from this nightmare. But the truth was, she wasn't. Sure she could. She wasn't sure how much longer they would be able to outrun the danger. The enemy was closing in on them and their time was running out. The human motioned for her to move quickly, and they began to move toward the maintenance tunnels. Every step felt like it might be their last. They had no idea what awaited them, but Zara couldn't afford to hesitate. She had to lead her children out of this nightmare, no matter what it took. They reached the access hatch that led to the tunnels. The human quickly worked the controls, his fingers flying over the panel with practiced ease. The hatch hissed open, revealing the narrow, dimly lit tunnel beyond. It was their only way out. "Go," the human said, his voice a low command. Zara squeezed her children's hands, urging them forward. She could hear the distant sounds of soldiers, their voices growing louder as they closed in. The human moved first, slipping into the darkness of the tunnel, his movements fluid and precise. Zara followed quickly, pulling Rhina and Kylo with her. The tunnel was tight, the walls cold and damp. They moved quickly, barely able to see in the darkness. Zara's breath came in short, ragged gasps, her mind racing as they crawled deeper into the bowels of the ship. The only sound was the faint shuffle of their feet, the distant hum of the ship's engines, and the echo of their own breathing. But then, a sound that froze her blood. A loud crash echoed from behind them. The door to the vault had been breached. "They're here," the human said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to move faster." Zara's heart skipped a beat. The invaders had found them. They had no time left. Her children, her heart ached as she pulled them closer, pushing them forward. But then ahead of them, a figure appeared in the darkness. A shadow that loomed, tall and menacing. Zara froze, her breath catching in her throat. The invaders had anticipated their escape. They were trapped. The human stepped forward, his body blocking the tunnel's narrow opening. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice a hard command. He had no weapon in hand, but Zara knew he wasn't afraid. He was ready to face whatever came their way. Zara could see the gleam of the invaders' armor, the cruel smile on the enemy's face as they stepped forward, their weapons raised. She was about to lose everything, everything she had fought for. Her children. Her hope. But then, in that moment of terror, something inside her snapped. With a sudden, fierce cry, Zara grabbed the weapon in her hand and charged forward, her heart filled with a surge of fury she hadn't known she was capable of. The invader's eyes widened in surprise as she fired, the shot echoing in the tunnel. The invader staggered back, and Zara's pulse surged with a rush of satisfaction. The human followed, his eyes gleaming with the same fire. But as the last invader fell, Zara's eyes locked onto something she hadn't noticed before. There, at the end of the tunnel, was a hidden exit, a narrow opening that led to the surface of Lunath. "Go," the human barked, his voice urgent. "We're almost there." Zara didn't hesitate. She grabbed her children and ran. They were so close to freedom now. But as they emerged into the open air, the wind howling around them, the realization hit her. This was it. They had made it. This far, but the true cost of their survival was still unknown. In the distance, she could see the smoldering remains of Lunath, a world forever changed by the horrors they had survived. But at that moment, Zara held her children close, the weight of their survival heavy in her chest. They had made it through the worst. And now, as they stepped into the unknown, the only thing that mattered was that they were alive. And that would have to be enough.